Hi there, reader here. It's been a while, but I'm always coming across small things as well as larger articles, and I kind of like to share things as I go. A lot of the stuff that I'm reading right now is about the progressive movement and its origins, and so the tactics that we see in our everyday experience in the news, things that are going on right now. And I just came across something rather interesting. I've always heard this quotation about the big lie, and it's always been attributed to Joseph Goebbels. You've probably heard it before yourself too, which is something to the effect of if you tell a lie often enough and loud enough, then people begin to believe it as truth. I've always thought it was Joseph Goebbels. Turns out it's not. And it's interesting not just whom it actually comes from, but how that person then goes on to interpret that concept of the big lie. So I thought I'd share this today with folks, and make of it as you will. I make of it as I see headlines of crowds and demonstrations and arson and vandalism and violence, and I'm thinking all these things fit into what I'm about to read here. So for those who are really out of the historic picture, this fellow, Joseph Goebbels, we start off with, was a member of the Nazi regime in Germany in the 1930s and then 40s. He was Paul Joseph Goebbels, and he lived from 1897 to 1945, May 1st. He was part of the National Socialist Party in Germany during that time, or he became part of that party anyway. And he was originally, strangely enough, a philologist, which is he studied language. So he's a politician and philologist. And so it would make sense that he would then understand how language works. Then, of course, Goebbels, the philologist, becomes if I'm not mistaken, he was the propaganda minister under Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party. So he also was the fellow who advocated the extermination of the Jews in the Holocaust, which, as we all know, they actually put into practice. And Adolf Hitler was he was the party boss. The quotation about the big lie has always been attributed to Goebbels, but I found just the other day that it isn't actually Goebbels who said this about the big lie. So I'm looking right now at the Jewish Virtual Library, and this is a project of AICE, and it's fairly trustworthy, I think. And this is the article that they have, very brief article on this big lie. It says, quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state." Now, if you're critiquing the state, that's a very harsh critique of the state, because the state, according to this, will suppress any dissent, and it will continue telling a lie until you believe it. But if you are the state, this is more like a playbook. It's more like this is what we have to do as those who control the narrative. So the article goes on to say this: "This quotation is an excellent definition of the big lie. However, there seems to be no evidence that it was used by Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, though it is often attributed to him." That's interesting. Okay, that's interesting. "The original description of the big lie," the article says, "appeared in Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler." Now, if you haven't read Mein Kampf, that's okay. My understanding historically, and I may get this wrong, is that Adolf Hitler, who was the leader of the brown shirt movement, the socialist movement in Germany during the 1930s, he and his cronies tried to take over the government by violence in something called, I think, the Beer Hall Putsch. And he was basically arrested after this failed attempt to take over the government. And there he was thrown into prison, and there he wrote this log of his not just his course to become leader of the brown shirts and eventually leader of Germany, but also his struggle against what he perceived as the corruption of modernity, and his struggle to make a socialist paradise in Germany. And that was Mein Kampf. And in it, he has a number of ideas that are very, they're bone chilling. Worth reading Mein Kampf simply to see the mind of Adolf Hitler, the workings of the mind of Adolf Hitler. And if you don't want to do that, totally understand that. The article goes on to say this: Adolf Hitler applied this idea of the big lie to the behavior of Jews rather than as a tactic he advocated. Specifically, he accused Viennese Jews of trying to discredit the Germans' activities during World War I. Hitler wrote of the Jews, quote, unqualified capacity for falsehood, end quote, and, quote, that in the big lie there is always a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. And thus, Hitler says, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths. And they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. From time immemorial, however, the Jews have known better than any others how falsehood and calumny can be exploited. Now pause for a minute. That's the end of that quote. But pause for a minute, because this is not Adolf Hitler saying this is how we should do things. This is Adolf Hitler saying this is how the state, and he equates the state with the capital Jews. His whole philosophy was that the Jews controlled the state. They were one and the same thing. And, it's Adolf Hitler, so whatever. He is recognizing something that the state does. And he's recognizing the way that the majority of the people respond to the state. And he says, I think rather accurately, that the majority of people have a hard time accepting or swallowing the big lie. And yet they fall victim to it. In other words, they can't accept that it is a lie. It's so big, it can't be a lie. Everybody's saying that this is true, so therefore it must be true. All the news media says it's true, therefore it must be true. All the politicians are saying it's true, therefore it must be true. All my neighbors are saying it's true, therefore it must be true. That's the big lie. And he also says that they, in their simplicity, which is pejorative, but they more readily fall victims to that lie, that big lie, than they do to small or little lies. And every day they often tell small lies in little matters, but they would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. So they're ashamed to resort to a large-scale falsehood, but they tell little lies. But they have a hard time accepting that anybody else would tell large-scale falsehoods. And so they can't believe that this huge event would actually be a falsehood. That's, I think, a very insightful statement about human nature and about crowd mentality and about the majority of citizens of any state. Most of us, it seems, we tell little lies, during the course of our day, but we don't go telling whoppers generally. And so it's hard for us to accept that other people do tell whoppers or could tell whoppers. Surely they don't, because I don't, right? Moreover, he says, it doesn't come into the heads of most people to fabricate these colossal truths. Most people just don't do so. And so they don't have, they can't believe that other people have a certain impudence to distort truth so infamously, so much. That guy, surely he can't be saying this thing unless it were true. He wouldn't be making it up. he couldn't be doing it for the fact that he's paid off, or he wouldn't be doing it, or she wouldn't be doing it because they have vested interest, or because they have somebody else who's involved, or they're getting a steady stream of money. Surely that wouldn't be the case. So Adolf Hitler's analyzing human nature here, and he has something which I think is valid about the way that human nature works. Now, the thing here to consider is that it's an analysis of the state in Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. It's not a playbook for how the Germans, the socialists, are going to go about running the state yet. But like a lot of these analysts of human nature and analysts of politics, when they got into power, strangely, they actually employed the very psychology that they had expressed objection to originally. So just as Adolf Hitler seems to object to the state telling the big lie when the state is run by people he objects to, namely the Jews, when he gets into power, as he does after the brown shirts, after he's released from jail and the brown shirts actually gain power in the Reichstag, and eventually they come to control the Weimar Republic and then dispense with the Weimar Republic. Once they do so, this very insight into human nature becomes a playbook for the National Socialists. And that's where Goebbels comes in. So we talk about then, how does he employ this? And this is where the article gets, I think, very, very rich. It says here, the OSS, which is the if I remember right, it's a British Secret Service. The psychological profile of Hitler described his use of the big lie. Quote, his primary rules were never allow the public to cool off. I'm going to pause here for a minute. And as I read these, just think, how many of these are pertinent to what you're seeing in the news today? How many of these things are pertinent to what you are being manipulated to do through social media or through news channels? So, Adolf Hitler's primary rules after he gets into power, the National Socialists, were 1, never allow the public to cool off. Never admit a fault or wrong. Never concede that there may be some good in your enemy. Never leave room for alternatives. Never accept blame. Concentrate on one enemy at a time and blame him for everything that goes wrong. People will believe a big lie sooner than a little one. And if you repeat it frequently enough, people will sooner or later believe it. Is there a group right now that doesn't seem to allow the populace to cool off, that is telling them this is the next thing you need to be worried about or afraid of or angry about, or the next thing or the next thing or the next thing? Dr. James Lindsay has talked about this, both on the left and the right, that there does seem to be a tendency to keep people constantly agitated. What Marshall McLuhan refers to as a perpetual state of mental rutting, though I would say it's probably emotional rutting as well. Rutting, for those of you who are brought up with nice people, rutting means sexual behavior. So mental rutting or emotional rutting, a constant turbulence, a constant eros, a constant desire to claim that thing or dominate that thing. It's like lust in action. Is there a group that will never admit fault or wrong? Is there a group in our society right now that never concedes any good in the enemy? Even when the enemy seems to be doing what the people want, or even when the enemy seems to be doing something that is actually very good and decent and noble as humanity goes. Is there a group that does that, never concedes that? Is there a group that never leaves room for alternatives? No, never leaving room for anything that maybe we could do this instead. Maybe this might be the truth. Maybe this is possible. Is there a group that does it? Is there a group that refuses to accept blame for, I don't know, when a city burns down or when, property gets vandalized? Is there a group that does that? Is there a group that concentrates on one enemy at a time, like one public figure, and they just go after that public figure almost in a knee-jerk, violent, rabid manner? Is there a group that does it? And is there a people that refuses to accept that a huge event might have been a gigantic lie? I don't know, just wondering, because that certainly seems to be the OSS psychological profile of Adolf Hitler's tactics. That seems to be the case. But, the article finishes here by saying, Goebbels, back to our Goebbels man, Goebbels did describe the big lie in different language in an article he wrote in 1941 entitled Churchill's Lie Factory. So here he is going after after Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England. But Goebbels was here accusing the British of this ploy, which is interesting because there's a thing which is called diversion and then projection. Diversion is where you divert the conversation away from the main thing and you go after something else instead. And projection is where you take things that you're guilty of and you project them onto somebody else and say, that person over there is, sinful in this way or that way. That they're the one filled with lust, or they're the one filled with lies, or they're the one that's filled with violence, rather than saying we do this because you don't want to admit guilt yourself. So Goebbels ended up accusing Winston Churchill of taking this big lie and running with it. Now, whether Churchill did or not, I don't know. J.R.R. Tolkien, the man who wrote Lord of the Rings, hated Churchill and thought that Churchill was a thug. And there's some argument, we could talk about that. But it's interesting that Goebbels in 1941, this right near the beginning of the war, at least for America, 39, the war commenced there in Europe, and 41, America entered. So right at the beginning, Goebbels is accusing Churchill of using the big lie, which might have been a form of diversion. Those Brits, they're using that big lie. We Germans are not using the big lie. Those Brits, they're guilty of, hypocrisy. We're not guilty of hypocrisy. Those Brits, they're guilty of busting up and frauding the people and taking all our money and being corrupt beyond, but we're not guilty of that at all. So here Goebbels says the following. He says, the English follow the principle that when one lies, one should lie big and stick to it. They keep up their lies, even at the risk of looking ridiculous. That's the end of that quotation. Randall Bitwork argues that neither Hitler nor Goebbels would admit to lying. Goebbels always maintained that propaganda had to be truthful. Sorry, this is a quotation. Goebbels, quote, always maintained that propaganda had to be truthful. That doesn't mean he didn't lie, but it'd be a pretty poor propagandist who publicly proclaimed that he was going to lie. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that James Lindsay, Dr. James Lindsay, if you don't follow his podcast of New Discourses, I highly recommend New Discourses. But James Lindsay says that this is absolutely the case, and he even read the diary or the account of a former Hitler youth who kind of says this very thing, that propaganda always has to have this backbone, if you will, of truth to it, which quite stunning to me because, of course, the National Socialists, they did a lot of lying, not the least of which was, hey, Jews, why don't you come into this vacation spot? It's a lovely little place called Auschwitz. That was kind of a big lie there. Anyway, interesting thing. This is just an insight into human nature, an insight into how Adolf Hitler thought and the National Socialists thought. It's an insight into how the state can operate when the state doesn't really care about its people, or the state is trying to push something that maybe is not terribly good. So anyway, there it is. Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler on The Big Lie. Hope it's been helpful. And my advice would be, don't swallow the big lie. Yeah. Okay. See you next time. Bye bye.